Over the past decade, our next speaker has been shaping and informing strategic policy planning in Australia's defence, intelligence and law enforcement communities. He holds a PhD and Advanced Masters of National Security Policy from the Australian National University. Would you please welcome to the stage Senior Manager of Strategy and Consulting at CyberCX and Expert Associate at the ANU National Security College, Dr. William A. Stoltz.
Well, good morning, everyone. Middle of the day session. We're halfway there. Let's push on. Unfortunately, I don't have any uplifting messages to kind of bounce off Bex. I think we're kind of complementary in our approaches. Is that changing? There we go. Right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. As I mentioned, I believe my presentation today will be quite complementary with Bex. In this session, I'll be speaking to you from the experience of my career that has included government roles, strategic advisory services and academia. I know academics can have a tendency to speak in abstractions, which I will try my best to avoid today. After all, your businesses are dealing with the practical realities of our complex world, and I want to discuss practical steps that industry can take to prepare Australia for a potentially hostile future. In my remarks today, I'll give you an overview of the key threats driving our current environment. I'll then outline two policy objectives of the People's Republic of China that I believe will exacerbate this threat environment, before I then get to the meat of my presentation, which is to outline a plan for national preparedness that I believe Australian industry advocates need to start calling for. So, to the threat environment. Our current threat environment, as Beck has touched on, is defined by at least 6 persistent threats that are impacting industry in Australia and abroad. Industrial espionage. We are in the grips of an intense technology competition as states and state-backed enterprises seek to seize control of the defining intellectual property that will determine the future of global wealth and power. Biotechnology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and energy are among the fields that will reshape our world, and the race to dominate these areas is intensifying. Where they are interacting with such knowledge, businesses and universities and state research institutions are all subject to espionage operations. Digital means of infiltration are making this easier, with legacy systems, poorly secured entry points, and sometimes malicious insiders, all being means for R&D and trade secrets to be stolen. State espionage. As has been mentioned several times today, DG of Security Mike Burgess has noted that espionage targeting Australian institutions and personnel has reached a hitherto unmet level. This is the case in Australia and most developed countries. The collection of secret intelligence in its various forms can have an important role in helping states manage crises and avoid conflict. However, the current intensity of foreign espionage, including from seemingly friendly states as well as adversaries, arguably is contributing to international instability. In addition to putting Australia's national security at risk, this behaviour adds pressure to our international relationships and increases the prospect of damaging diplomatic incidents that harm our ability to work together and manage crises. Sabotage. Sabotage or disruption operations are rife, typically including the targeting of other states' critical infrastructure to degrade and debilitate essential services. Digital tools make such activities comparatively more accessible for a wider range of actors to perform. A recent worrying example of how this threat is evolving includes the activities of a Chinese threat actor, Volt Typhoon. Jointly identified last year by Microsoft and Five Eyes agencies, Volt Typhoon exemplifies a new approach to offensive cyber operations, whereby the focus of attacks have been to quietly infiltrate critical systems, not for the purpose of immediately extracting data or deploying ransomware, but in order for state-backed hackers to embed themselves within strategic networks in anticipation of being activated in a time of war. Foreign interference. Interference operations targeting other countries' political institutions, economies, and information environments are now a common feature of state behaviour, especially for autocracies that are seeking to undermine the social cohesion, stability, and political effectiveness of democratic states. Russia has distinguished itself over the past century as exercising and perfecting a tradition of subversive statecraft that effectively generates confusion and discord within target societies. This tradition has been supercharged with the weaponization of social media and digital connectivity. The PRC's approach is arguably better resourced but less consistently effective, as PRC operators struggle against language and cultural barriers that routinely result in clunky and ineffective attempts at interference. That said, the PRC appears to be having successes against smaller states, such as in the South Pacific, where there is a susceptibility to financial coercion and inducement among politicians and officials. We should assume that the multiple agencies engaging in foreign interference at the direction of the Chinese government will be learning from past operations and that they will rapidly improve the effectiveness of their approach. The ability to use AI to create realistic synthetic online content is also already improving Chinese actors' ability to create disinformation that is harder to detect. Regional conflict. Several regions of the world are now entrenched in armed conflict or at risk of tipping over the edge. There's Russia's war in Ukraine, hostilities in the Middle East, as well as nascent conflicts in the Caucasus, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. In addition to the grim human toll of these conflicts, they have repeatedly impacted global supply chains and impeded international commerce. Containing these conflicts and ensuring they do not become flashpoints for wider great power confrontation will remain a persistent challenge, as will managing the humanitarian crises they have created. Organised crime and cybercrime. Transnational serious and organised crime groups are multinational billion-dollar enterprises comprising diversified combinations of illicit and legitimate revenue streams. In addition to the global trade in narcotics, these organisations have established themselves as money laundering engines that work hand in glove with pariah states to enrich corrupt elites and undermine the effectiveness of international sanctions regimes. These groups cause profound human suffering and destabilise governments. They also exploit and have a corrupting effect upon legal businesses that they come into contact with. Important to their contemporary success is that they are tech-savvy and early adopters of digital means of turning illicit profit. As a result, cybercrime is now one of the most profitable criminal enterprises, accounting for billions of dollars a year in Australia alone. Cybercrime actors are deploying ransomware to extort Australian businesses, whilst also looking for ways to steal data that can be on-sold online. All types of businesses are being targeted, but some states are creating permissive environments where they can turn a blind eye to cyber criminals operating in their jurisdiction, so long as they are hacking external adversaries. New technologies, such as AI-assisted tools, offer new protections, but equally, this tech is likely to ensure the barriers to entry for would-be criminals remains low. These threats are likely to remain persistent features of your business's operating environments. Yet I would like to point to two additional trends that I believe are emerging that are likely to shape the future of security in the Indo-Pacific and, regrettably, increase the possibility of war arising within the next decade. Each of these relate to the current policies of the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping, so it should be noted that change in Xi's administration could alter these policies, but at present this is their pathway. Firstly, China is preparing to accelerate its decoupling from Western economies and other markets that it does not perceive as having sufficient control of. China has been building up large reserves of gold to give it the ability to break from the US dollar system and insulate itself from future economic sanctions. It is stockpiling critical technology components like semiconductors, energy components, and it is building up reserves of key commodities. It is also onshoring IP and critical skills by restricting the travel of scientists, entrepreneurs, and former officials. It is doing so to reduce the extent to which it can be coerced and contained by the West. In so doing, the PRC is improving its ability to wage war should it choose. Secondly, expect to see the PRC to exert more direct control over its immediate neighbours. For over a decade now, the PRC has utilised its One Belt, One Road investment initiatives to build and gain controlling stakes in foreign infrastructure, especially in South and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, state-backed firms have sought to embed Chinese technology and technology norms within developing states under its Digital China agenda. They have done so by offering free education to build the digital workforce of developing states, and physical infrastructure projects like the Lao-China high-speed railway have been used to embed Chinese telecommunications systems from firms like Huawei into neighbouring states. The objective of Digital China is for the PRC to become the world's centre of gravity for technology development, manufacturing, and to set the rules of how technology is integrated into people's lives. These initiatives have laid the groundwork for the PRC to exert significant control and coercion over target states, especially those in its immediate vicinity. I believe we can expect this control to be aggressively exerted as China seeks to kick back against US strategies of integrated deterrence that Beck was speaking about before, and perceived policies of containment. As China seeks to exert this control over mostly developing states, Western businesses and investors may find themselves impacted if operating in these markets. So, increasing security interventions. In response to the current threat environment that I outlined earlier and the plausible future driven by the PRC's strategies, we are seeing Western governments, including Australia, undertaking several new security interventions into their own economies, some of which have been already discussed today. The United States, the UK, and to a certain extent Australia, are evaluating the introduction of new step-in powers to allow the government to direct the operations of private businesses where it is determined that these businesses are not adequately protecting themselves or have otherwise become derelict in their duties. A raft of new reporting requirements are being introduced, especially for firms deemed to be essential to the operations of critical infrastructure or so-called systems of national significance. We've seen the White House introduce a growing range of restrictions to shape sensitive national supply chains. These measures have impacted the extent to which American firms can purchase Chinese manufactured technology and components. This has included restrictions on Chinese-designed semiconductors, essential port infrastructure, commercial drones, and Internet of Things devices, to name a few. Similar interventions are constantly under review by the Australian government, and we expect to see standards concerning IoT devices tighten shortly. Firms and universities engaged or adjacent to sensitive research can also expect restrictions on personnel, including security clearances as an abiding feature. Finally, national mobilisation considerations are being actively examined in the UK and US as these states scrutinise how domestic industries would be called upon for repurposed to support national defence efforts in a time of war. For the UK, this has been spurred by the prospect of an expanded war in Europe arising from Russia's war on Ukraine. As I'll discuss, I believe Australia is behind on laying down key policies concerning how to improve the preparedness of our industrial sector and wider society for international crises. So, how should industry respond to all this? On the one hand, businesses face the impacts of international threats upon its operations, and on the other, it must manage the shifting sands of government security interventions. I believe Australian industry needs to do two things as a result. Firstly, more firms need to be proactive in understanding their supply chain risk. Companies need to scrutinise the third parties they transact with overseas and assure themselves of the security of these supply chains. They need to weigh up the possibility of insider threats and contamination of technology supply chains with their risk appetite as a business. If the risk isn't worth it, businesses will need to reconfigure their operations. Businesses should also examine their proximity to nationally significant services and consider their value to the national interest to identify the prospect of their operations being subject to additional security interventions. Secondly, in the absence of advice from government about what the likely policy settings are going to be in a time of national crisis, industry should be proactive in advocating for the policies you believe will be proportionate and effective. This will help guard against government overreach and ineffective interventions that nevertheless carry significant productivity impacts. For my part, I believe industry should encourage the Australian government to work with the private sector on a first 90 days national mobilisation plan. What I mean by this is a mobilisation plan for Australia's survival during the first 90 days of a war or similar catastrophe in our region, such as a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea. Informed by experience during the pandemic, 90 days represents the time frame in which we should expect international shipping lines of communication to be reconfigured in response to a conflict. It is admittedly an otherwise somewhat arbitrary time frame, but it is intended to focus our minds on what those absolutely vital supplies that are at present being, it it is intended to focus our minds on what are those absolutely vital supplies that at present are most likely to be severed by a conflict to our north, and that need to be bolstered if Australia's economy and military are to sustain long enough while international shipping is redirected and reconfigured. The three most important supplies for Australia at present that would be catastrophically severed by war are technology and components, energy and fuel, and pharmaceuticals, including raw materials. These three things are vital to life as we know it. Disruption in their availability, even for a short period, would threaten social stability and Australian lives. Yet, Australia has never met its international obligations to have a 90-day fuel reserve, and our domestic fuel refining capacity is going backwards. Recent estimates I've seen suggest that if supply lines were cut today, Australia would have a sufficient fuel for somewhere between 2 weeks and 6 days of demand. Nor are our medical stocks strong enough, as current shortages of IV fluid demonstrate. 90% of Australia's medicines and pharmaceutical materials are imported, with a significant portion of that being from China. Meanwhile, Australia has no substantial domestic capacity to produce semiconductors and other components of digital devices, despite possessing the requisite raw materials, nor is our capacity to recycle digital devices sufficient. A First 90 policy would focus on directing Australian industry to increase domestic stockpiles and onshore manufacturing capacity up to a minimum standard. Meanwhile, we should also focus on diversifying Australia's sources of these goods away from China so that we have redundancy if sea routes through Southeast Asia and our north are impacted. I believe one of the reasons industry has at present not been given greater assurance of our national preparedness is for two false reasons. Firstly, I believe there's been a view within government that to talk openly about preparing Australia's industrial base for a time of war would cause alarm and panic. That by discussing it, the prospect somehow becomes more likely. I think the opposite is true. Clarity about our nation's contingency planning can only improve market confidence by demystifying how the private sector can expect government to behave in a crisis. Secondly, I believe a position has been set that to discuss the need to diversify and domesticate key supplies away from China would harm the relationship and signal that Australia is itself preparing for aggression. Again, I believe this position, the opposite is true. China has itself been onshoring its key supplies and lashing down the loose ends of its economy in anticipation of stormier weather. If the PRC were to criticise Australia for doing the same, we could point to their example as simply demonstrating prudence, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. Finally, I believe strengthening our preparedness in this way adds to Australia's ability to deter those states, considering that maybe, just maybe, they can achieve their ambitions through force. It signals that Australia takes the prospect of war in our region seriously and as a potential reality in the short term. Bracing ourselves for the first 90 days would show that while Australia does not want war, we intend to endure through it should one arise. An Australia that cannot easily be dislocated from the world and swept off the map is one that would complicate the planning of any would-be adversary. It is also an Australia that would be better placed to spring back on the other side of an international conflict. Thank you.
William, thank you so very much for your wisdom and your advice. If you wouldn't mind staying around for a few questions, because you've touched on a lot of different areas there, and we have a question online already. If you'd like to ask a question in the room, please shoot up your hand, announce who you are, and go right ahead. This question is, introduction of these policies is going to significantly increase cost for the end user. Will this disrupt Australians further given the current cost of living crisis?
I think the answer is sadly yes. The reality is, and I think Beck was mentioning before, we have subsisted off a peace dividend for a very, very long time, and the Australian people have been conditioned to that. We've been conditioned to a just-in-time economy where we can have a new iPhone every year, where we can buy, new TV from JB Hi-Fi every second year. God, we treat cars as if they're disposable pieces of tech. we need to have a mind shift around that, and that's where political leadership comes in to actually start having that conversation with the Australian people, that in order to kind of sustain the fundamentals of our society that we desperately want to endure, we may have to endure potential costs or shortages in the availability of other things that are perhaps a little bit more disposable. So I agree that there will be more cost, but the sooner that that cost can be openly discussed with the Australian people, I think that's better.
Thank you. Do we have a question up the back there, Brenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Doctor, thank you very much for that interesting and thought-provoking presentation. My name's Graham Coleman from Queensland. My question will give away my interest. In a little under 8 years' time, Australia will once again host an Olympic Games. There's 206 National Olympic Committees, 193 member states of the United Nations are involved in those 206 committees. Based on what you've told us today, do you see Australia, in particularly Brisbane, hosting the 2032 Olympic Games as increasing our vulnerability across the matters that you've discussed today?
Wow, I did not expect that question. That's a really good question. I think what it does though is it's a useful little stress test of at least one part of Australia about its capacity to rapidly mobilise a whole bunch of industrial sectors to achieve a goal. And so in that sense, I think it could be a good measure of how well government can actually work with industry to meet a whole lot of shortfalls, whether it's around construction of new facilities, whether it's around being able to reconfigure our cities to deal with changing population density. So in that sense, it will be an interesting test.
Thank you for that question. Who else would like to ask a question in the room? While you're thinking, there's another one online. And I'll paraphrase it. There was news last year regarding the government and sensitive agencies completely banning the use of brands from China. Does Australia genuinely care about the trustworthiness of hardware?
Oh, I think so. I think the Australian government absolutely cares about the trustworthiness of the hardware. I think what is causing anxiety, though, is our ability to actually deal with the problem. I mean, we're not in the position of the United States where we have a whole lot of our own sovereign capacity to do advanced manufacturing, and where we've got the luxury to be able to say, all these Chinese businesses that are involved in development of microchips and semiconductors, we're just going to cut them out of the supply chain. Australia doesn't have that luxury, and I guess that's where I think it's really important that industry start leaning on government now to say, what are you actually going to do in a time of crisis? Because Australia is not an economy that can copy the same sort of measures from an economy like US, but our policymakers are very much looking at the US for lessons and guidance, and at some point there's going to be a bit of a disconnect between what's possible in the US when it comes to inculcating their economy and what's possible here, and industry needs to be on top of government in reminding them of that, I think.
That's a perfect segue to selfishly a question that I'd like to ask, because you did mention the semiconductor industry. What are the barriers to Australia creating a robust semiconductor industry here?
Well, I'll give a plug to a paper that Beck's colleagues at ASPI published, I think, a year or two ago, where they actually outlined how Australia might actually stand up an industry like this because we have the raw materials. I think the challenge, though, is a workforce that's really able to do that sophisticated high-end manufacturing. And at present, given that Taiwan and the US kind of dominate the supply chain, it would be difficult to make the operations in Australia immediately commercially viable. Hence why it's been discussed that perhaps the Australian government should underwrite the expenses of that potentially as part of the Made in Australia agenda that's being spruiked at the moment. And I think that agenda itself is an indication that government is thinking about these things. It does realise that there needs to be greater sovereign capacity in a bunch of key areas. But as I was kind of suggesting before, I think maybe our priority should be focused more tightly on just that initial 90-day period of contingency planning so that we get those fundamentals right. And I think that's easier to convey to the Australian people as well when you're saying we're doing these interventions so that we're prepared for this particular window of time. It's a bit more tangible to explain why the cost of things is going up and why there might be interventions in the market.
What other questions do we have from the room? If anyone would like to pick William's huge brain, now is the time to do so. While you're thinking on that 90-day plan, are there other countries that have a similar kind of plan, or is this a new idea?
No, absolutely. I mean, you go to Scandinavian countries, pretty much any country along Russia's border has put quite a lot of effort into thinking about these things and has communicated to their population quite routinely over a series of decades that how the country will behave in the context of a conflict. I think it's the Swedish government. They have a regular series of pamphlets and a public information campaign about shaping people's understanding of how to behave if there is an invasion of their country. And I don't think you've seen those countries become overly securitized. I don't think you're seeing their populations being panicked or afraid. If anything, there's a level of reassurance that comes in because people don't see the prospect of conflict as this like absolutely, unimaginable thing. They see it as like, okay, it's a possibility, but life will go on. And I think the example of Ukraine as well has been their ability to sustain something resembling an ordinary life whilst having a significant portion of their population engaged in conflict. And I think they're also another example of a country that got those initial periods of hours and days right to be able to endure. I mean, one of the reasons that there is still a Ukrainian Air Force is because they had the prudence to build hardened Air Force bunkers. We don't have those. Just these basic things about how do we get the fundamentals right in that short period so that we can sustain ourselves. Yeah.
It certainly seems to make sense. Any last bids for questions before I let our speaker go? Would you please put your hands together for William A. Stoltz?
Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating.